to where I claim Shiluba had sprung from, we will notice the description of the late 19th century Lunda Kingdom notables were characteristics of the stereotyped Kasai-based Baluba. In addition to this, reference was made to the surrounding Lunda Kingdom populations, who presumably were some populations who ended up as their subjects. It is in this reference we can discover the populations they were speaking of were those known today as Baluba Lulua and a Lua, which is another ethnic group likely separated from Gede populations who resided northeast of the Lunda Kingdom. It's interesting to note the pierced earlobe and reed-through nose of the Lua people likely developed independently, similar to other indigenous populations around the planet. This statement is made so we do not misconstrue it with the Sultan Swahili Arabs' ritualistic practice against their captives, which later turned into a despised fashion in North Kasai. Another interesting note is, why were the Lua not categorized as Baluba, considering their language is closer to various Shiluba dialects? During the invading Europeans' quest around the Lunda Kingdom, reference was made to savage populations who were likely Gede, Bashilange and Konda speaking populations who were not definitively understood as Baluba at this time due to the primitive connotations applied to their weaponry. For those who watch part 7, if we understand the Shiluba language was the language of Kalamba Mukenge's trade around the mid-19th century, then we should understand the area he enslaved did not comprise of Shiluba speakers, but Konda and Gede speakers, who would eventually understand the Shiluba language. In this time period, it was common for conquerors to usurp via claiming kinship, as seen with Tipu Tip via Kasongolushi or Shiam Ambul Ngong via a Kuba queen. In this case, when Kalamba Mukenge arrived at the Lulua River area, he may have done the same thing towards the indigenous populations within the Lulua River area. As it appears, the remaining customs of the original populations came to a decline in a short space of time during Kalamba Mukenge's rule. The main customs before Kalamba Mukenge's arrival was scarification, including a specific sequence of patterns which provided a vital clue on which populations he enslaved. Though vividly known, it is documented an elder from the Lulua River area was against Kalamba Mukenge's rule. There was a depiction of this elder, and he had an elaborate form of scarification, which without exaggeration are identical to the scarification seen amongst Konda speaking populations. These scarifications were associated with created figures used to boost fertility amongst women. Among many Konda speaking populations, the area around the chin was considered an important or sacred area, which may have been associated with medicinal woody plants and trees referred to as wanga or manga. The Lulua ritual for the women's fertility was referred to as Mwanga wa Shibola, which complements a healing ritual known as Zebola among some Konda speaking populations, better known as Mongo. It is useful to note some populations around this Lulua river engaged in the same ritual and refer to it as Mbombo, which has unquestionable affinities with a Mongo-based deity. For the fact there is more than one name for this Shibola ritual, it is self-evident that a variety of groups were taken into Kalamba Mukenge's state. Within the Lulua Shibola ritual, we find undeniably Konda names applied to planted trees to honor an ancestral lineage for fertility. The Baluba Lulua named these trees Kasabankusu and Bumbu. Consider there is a Konda speaking group known as Basankusu in the old Equator province, and consider Bumbu is likely a variation of Mbombo or Bumba, which are all distinctively Mongo features. 19th to early 20th century scarification patterns from the old equator in Bumba up to North Kasai and Manyema appear to be exclusive to Mongo lands. There is unarguably a consistency with the scarification patterns and designs despite the geographical distance of each group within Mongo lands. When we look closer on some of the Bwangawashibola figures, we can see the chin area decoration resembles that of the Mongo women taken at an invading Europeans mission, which was funded by an East London institute. Do note, Konda speaking populations in North Kasai, Sankuru district refer to the chin area as Manga. Similar to the photo of the Lusambo girl published as a Baluba girl, this photo has been presented as Baluba women. This photo was published as Baluba women despite the photo being taken in the equator away from the Baluba Lulua river. Reason to this is either the archive staff or the unknown photographer categorized them as Baluba because they were enslaved in the equator. For those who watch part 7 and 8 should know anyone captioned as Baluba in this period may not be Baluba, and this is another clear example. Up to today, this photo of 3 Mongo women is sometimes aggressively presented as Baluba without regard to the origins of the photo. In European museums, there is an aggressive presentation which created the notion that Kasai-based Baluba practiced scarification, but this scarification is abundantly represented on the Bwanga Washibola figures rather than on the people known as Lulua or Baluba Kasai. Further to this, there appears to be no archived scarification knives attributed to Kasai-based Baluba, which is strange. The situation becomes clear when we find the scarification knives exclusive to Konda speaking populations in Kasai. Remarkably, some patterns and marks were also engraved on the scarification knives, providing us a clue to some ethnographic material presented as Baluba or even Bakuba. Because there were various groups around Kalamba Mukenge's trade, I suspect some populations from the Lunda kingdom who were known for creating figures decided to depict the indigenous populations they saw in West Kasai. This claim is made as Konda speaking populations across Mongo lands were not known for making fetishes or figures, unless they have been what I would describe as Lubaized or Kubaized. This is a vital clue as Konda speaking groups known as Dengese, who are on the left side of the Sankuru district, were known to make some figures, just like the Konda speaking people of the Luba Manyema state. Even the Gede populations, which I am convinced carved an attribute of their god referred to as Ngan, which is short for Ngando, but the Europeans presented it as Bushongo. A quick side note for those who watch parts 4 may recall Gede was usually sidelined from so-called Bakuba presentations, and the British Museum agent attempted to insinuate the original Bushongo were Baluba, and the name Ngan had to have been borrowed by Baluba according to another European, despite Ngando being noted as a Mongo ancestor in Konda speaking oral tale. That's just something to think about. Even if you look for yourself, the Mbwangawa Shibola scarifications barely align with any photos captioned as Baluba or Lulua, except for the one elder who was against Kalamba Mukenge, and it is likely this man was from a Mongo Konda speaking population based on his scarification. It's useful to note the photographer for this Lulua man was also unknown. There seems to be a consistent parallel between unknown photographers and questionable ethnographic captions. There was, however, a drawing allegedly representing Kalamba Mukenge and his scarifications, though the invading European who drew this did not take the opportunity to get a photo of his scarifications, despite there being a documented amazement with Mwanga Washibola scarifications, and despite taking a photo of Kalamba Mukenge fully clothed. Also, the drawing of Kalamba Mukenge's scarifications is similar to the scarification photograph of the Lulua River elder who opposed Kalamba Mukenge. The same invading European interestingly placed the Lunda Kingdom location closer to the Lulua River before it was understood that the nucleus of the Lunda Kingdom was within northeast Angola. The expedition-related writings also accidentally draws a distinction between the original Bashilange populations and what he is calling Baluba of Kasai. Other drawings of Baluba-based Kasai closer resembled Lunda Kingdom and Angolan trader stereotypes associated with ivory collectors. Kalamba Mukenge's father would have held the title Tusolwe Ilunga. Ilunga is a term radiating outside of Kasai from the Luba Kingdom to the Lunda Kingdom, usually in reference to kings such as Shibanda Ilunga, who is documented to have helped develop the Lunda Kingdom. Kalamba's father, Tusolwe Ilunga, would have acquired such title from the Lunda Kingdom, especially with past inferences to previous Luba kings ruling over so-called savages. This gives reason for the invading Europeans to narrate a replication of this concept, which in this case would be Luba Kasai rulership over savages within Kasai. In summary, I am basically clarifying the original indigenous populations in West Kasai would have encountered Shiluba-speaking populations emerging from the Lunda Kingdom into the southern Kasai Kananga region up to Mbuji and Ngandazika. The indigenous populations around the Lulua River up to the Lubilange River became known as Lulua and Luba Kasai after being absorbed. The tricky part is, when did these Shiluba-speaking populations reach Mbuji and Ngandazika? We can reasonably summarize they reached Mbuji up to Ngandazika in at least around the 1860s onwards, as the Lunda Kingdom notables' description of people in Kasai interiors did not match the 1890s Baluba Kasai stereotype, which actually resembled the Lunda Kingdom notables themselves. There was likely a second wave of a mixed northern Lunda Shiluba speaking populations entering Kasai towards Kananga and Mbuji during disputes with their Angolan trading partners, who would eventually raid the Lunda Kingdom and western to southern centres of Kasai in the late 19th century. I argue these raids is actually what caused the so-called Baluba Kasai to flee to the Europeans' missionary post, where the Europeans collected them from Kananga to Mbuji and placed them in a caravan towards the Luebo American Missionary School, where they joined the first wave of Shiluba speakers from Kalamba Mukenge's slave trade. Staying consistent with the Baluba Kasai phenotypical stereotype, it's likely some northern Lunda Kingdom notables would have been part of this caravan to Luebo. Consider the Lunda Kingdom and its states would have undergone a degree of Arab influence and trade-related disputes, and these historical Lunda trade-related disputes with the Sultan Swahili Arabs may have been misconstrued with the Kasai raids, considering the Basonge were sometimes being referred to as Baluba, and the Basonge have clear records of fleeing Arab slave raids, as demonstrated in Part 5. Also in Part 7 I demonstrated invading Europeans and Americans going as far as Angola to train up evangelists who they planted in Kasai and presented them as enslaved returnees from Angola, followed by a Baluba Bambo name. As another Shiluba-speaking nucleus was developing at Luebo, most of the Kasai Konda-speaking populations were isolated in the Tetela Sankuru district, as many were fleeing revenge from invading Europeans because they murdered some invading Europeans during a series of revolts starting from 1895. Also, many of the Sankuru's Konda speaking populations refused to embrace Catholicism or Christianity until the invading Europeans moved many of the Shiluba speaking Luebo groups into Lusambo, which is when they began erecting churches across the Tetela Sankuru district. The Europeans also imported plantation watchmen and evangelists who the Konda speaking people of the Sankuru district called Sambala for the rubber tax collectors and Sambadishi for the evangelists, who were also known as Bambo, as demonstrated in part 7. In line with population movements towards Lusambo, there is a Shiluba speaking group known as Bakwaluntu, who has terms and dialects more akin to Rund, which supports the strong claim about recent presence from the Lunda kingdom. Consider in part 7 I mentioned some Shiluba speaking groups within the Bakwadishi family claim to have emerged from the Lunda kingdom. This claim becomes strengthened as it has been noted the Sangalumbangu origin of some Congo Kasai was actually northwest within Mbuji Mayi regions rather than in the Baluba homeland in Kananga. Lastly, the zebra was likely unknown amongst the first populations of Kasai, whilst the Shiluba nucleus includes the term for zebra. With this wrapped up, the next part we will look at the documented savages of Kasai. Stay tuned for parts 10 entitled Batetela are cannibals. Thanks for watching.
Kashama.
Ilukongo. Ilugala dulami kolodi. Ilugala dulami kolodi. Ilugala dulami kolodi. Ilugala dulami kolodi. Ilukongo. Batai masati. Yachala ngajombo. Babuna.
Good.